Hello, welcome to episode 11 of the Garden Revival BBQ, the podcast where we answer your big burning questions about gardening and don't grill any hamburgers. We record the podcast live on our Discord server. Join our community on gardenrev.com/discord. We don't take ourselves too seriously, but we're very serious about plants. I am your host, IG, the indecisive gardener with a penchant for English gardens and French desserts. Today, I am joined by one of our Garden Revival community members, Director of Growing Operations Wes, who will pull back the curtain on the inner workings of professional greenhouses and tell us how the cake is made, or something. I really like cake. Welcome to the show, Wes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for finding the time to be here. I know you've been traveling a lot lately. Is Director of Growing Operations a job that requires a lot of travel?
Not too much travel, but definitely there's a little bit of being on the road for meetings and trade shows and things like that. So it's actually kind of fun sometimes to leave the greenhouse and kind of get out there in the world, but it should slow down here as spring starts to pick up for us.
Well, maybe I'll get to see you this year at Cultivate in Columbus.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Have you always wanted a career that has to do with plants?
Actually, for me, no. Plants kind of came later. I originally began as a property manager, and it was something that I really did not enjoy. And when I was in my mid-20s, I realized I really needed to make a change in my life. So I went back to school to study plants because I had just begun to be interested in them. And during that time, I was working for a nursery in Southern California. And it was through that I started speaking to growers and really getting interested in being on the production side.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool. We usually talk to people who just have always gardened, but coming into it late and realizing this is it, this is the right thing for me. That's actually really inspiring. Not that 20 is late, but...
No, there was definitely a day my second year of college. I totally remember I was, in one of my labs for class, and we were all pulling weeds in the heat. And I was thinking about when I was a kid, I thought it was just torture, and here I am spending thousands of dollars a quarter to be able to have the opportunity. So it's funny how things change, huh?
Oh, wow. I still don't like to pull weeds. I think that's my least favorite task, and that's saying a lot because I really hate washing pots and stuff.
Yeah, that's all part of it, though.
Yep, it is. Gotta take the good with the bad and still love it. All right, so can you summarize what a director of growing operations does before we get into the nitty-gritty cake baking, really trying to make this analogy stick?
Yeah, sure. So, the title that I have at the greenhouse I work at is kind of unique. It's a little bit analogous to being a general manager. So my responsibility is overseeing all of the operation side of the company. So that is production scheduling, production, growing, order fulfillment, shipping, and facilities management. So basically, our company is divided into three pieces. So we have a controller that manages the financial side, a sales manager who manages sales and in-store merchandising, and then all of the rest kind of falls under my umbrella.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, and just a little bit of info. So the company I work for has three facilities. Our total acreage under greenhouse is right around 65 acres, and then we have another 40 to 50 acres of field production that we do. We do like a lot of perennials out there and some summer crops, fall crops like mums that really don't need to be grown in a greenhouse.
Wow. I can't wrap my mind around that much space. That's a lot.
A lot of walking for sure.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Get some exercise.
Yeah, definitely.
So what was your career progression like to get to this point?
So, mine, like I said, because I went back to school later, my career progression was probably not what it would be for someone who went to school right out of high school. But because I had a lot of management experience, and then I went into the nursery side as a manager, I went from being a manager at a retail nursery to then I actually just worked as part of the labor crew for the greenhouse on campus when I was in school. And luckily from there, because of my management experience, I actually graduated and went right into head grower position. So the
wow,
typical,
that's awesome.
Yeah, so it really worked out for me. And then from there, I became a production manager at a much bigger greenhouse. And then I moved from there to where I am now. So, kind of the typical career path would be for someone interested in the growing side. They would usually join a greenhouse as either what they call an irrigator sprayer or maybe an assistant grower, and then work up to a section grower where they have responsibility for a specific area of the greenhouse and have a team under them, and then from there they'd go to head grower. So I kind of skipped a few steps because I had experience managing teams before.
Okay, that makes sense. So what was your degree in, and is there sort of a range of degrees that get people into this world?
Yeah, because definitely the types of degrees offered depend on the school. There's not really kind of like a standardized degree. So the one I have is plant science, which was really heavy in lab work, and I went to Cal Poly Pomona, which is a polytechnic school. Their whole thing is hands-on learning. So, our labs would be, pruning in an orchard or driving a combine chopping corn, or actually
Uh-huh.
in a lab, tissue culture lab, or identifying diseases in plant pathology. So it's a lot of hands-on stuff. But a lot of people who go into growing will have a horticulture degree, a plant science degree, something along those lines. They're called something a little different depending on the school.
I think I've also heard greenhouse management is a degree.
Yeah, and that one looks a little bit more at the operation side, which I can say coming out of school I was weak on. So I was much heavier on the plant science side than on operations. That's something that I've learned while being in the industry.
Well, plus you come in with the management experience already, so
Yeah,
you're the
right.
whole package.
Well, we'll see. So,
All right, so where to start with all the wonderfully complex things you do in your job? It must be pretty seasonal, like the rest of us gardeners, unless we're near the equator where the weather's pretty even. But can you take us through the year, how the different things you grow and how that changes?
yeah, so for this, I'll probably talk a little bit more about my experience when I was a head grower because where I was before had a little bit different approach to it, and it kind of encompassed the whole year. So
Uh-huh.
typically, the season starts for us right around the week of Thanksgiving. That's
Hmm.
when we start propagating our crops for spring, and propagation is kind of a rolling window. So you have teams doing propagation weekly from Thanksgiving, which is usually around the 48th week of the year, all the way through, let's say, week 20, which is just after Mother's Day. And
Hmm.
so the time between Thanksgiving and around March 1st is when we're really heavy on propagation. 100% of the labor is going into propagation, and then starting
Okay.
March, we start shipping, and that's a really tricky time because you have to really keep your eye on the weather because it's easy to ship plants, but if you know it's going to freeze and you're going to lose them all, you have
Yeah.
a real issue on your hands. So
Yeah.
starting in March is when order fulfillment and shipping picks up and propagation begins to taper off, and then usually by May is just all out shipping. It's crazy. Trucks on the road, 15 hours a day loading trucks, and
Wow.
really, that's really long days getting everything out because Mother's Day is really like the Black Friday of the greenhouse industry.
Yeah, I
So,
bet. Everybody's
yeah.
itching to get started.
Yeah, exactly. So Mother's Day is really like probably the single biggest day, and just kind of interesting, for the majority of greenhouses, the time between, let's say, April 1 and June 1, so that's a 2 month period. Let's call it a 10-week period around there, is when most greenhouses make somewhere between 50 and 70% of their profit for the year. So spring is
Wow.
huge, of course. Um,
Yeah.
there's usually a bit of a lull around June, July, August when things warm up, but that's when in the greenhouse we'll be busy with propagating mums and poinsettias. And then in September, we start shipping mums into October. That's another really crazy time, depending on the greenhouse. But the ones I've been in that do mums, that gets really busy. And then there's a little break in November. And then after Thanksgiving, you go right back to propagation and shipping poinsettias. So there is a,
Yep.
a little bit of a lull, usually around July and again around November.
So, what is the supply chain like for the plants we as consumers buy? They don't go straight to us from you, and you probably get starts from somewhere too. Is that correct?
That depends on the greenhouse. So at one like mine, we do the vast majority of our propagation in-house. So um, we propagate plants kind of from three different input sources. So we do, seed plugs, we will propagate cuttings, and we can also do tissue culture. We do buy in some specialty items that are just really hard to grow, and we also bring in bulbs as well.
Hmm.
But typically, so seeds, they kind of come from all over. That's not really something I have a lot of knowledge of that supply chain. So I'll talk about the cutting side.
Okay.
The vast majority of cuttings that are grown for North American production are grown closer to the equator. So you see a lot from Costa Rica, southern Mexico, Ecuador. And one of the reasons why they're grown there is because they have consistent light year round, but also because they are one overnight flight to most of the production greenhouse facilities in North America. So
Oh,
um,
interesting.
yeah, so typically the way it works is they actually have to forecast out their cutting production by 18 months. So they're
Wow.
looking
Oh
18
my
months ahead.
God.
And we
Wow.
actually as greenhouses only order 6 to 8 months ahead. So it's really takes a lot of data analysis on their end, and it's
Hmm.
surprising that they get
Yeah.
it right as often as they do. So they forecast this out, they grow, they have really, really impressive sanitation protocols at these greenhouses where like there are rooms in the greenhouse. This is all for disease and pest prevention. There are rooms in
Uh-huh.
the greenhouse where these are the production greenhouses where only a few select people are ever allowed in there. And if the president of the company wanted to go into that greenhouse to look at it, they wouldn't even be allowed. So,
That's
they're really,
amazing.
really strict about it. Definitely sometimes we do get pests and disease, but there's a whole process for dealing with that. But typically, then once those orders are all booked, those cuttings are produced and then they get cut on a Sunday. They get overnighted Sunday night and then usually delivered to a greenhouse like mine on Mondays. And then we will stick all the cuttings and root them out. And then how many steps between a greenhouse like mine and the end customer really depends on who is selling those plants. But
Yeah.
typically, yeah, they get sent on a truck from the greenhouse directly to the store and then put on display and sold to the customer. So there are some cuttings that come from as far as Africa. There's farms in Africa that are
Wow.
built to produce cuttings for the European market. There are some that come from Africa, but like in my experience being on the west coast of the United States, growing in northern Washington, it's really difficult to produce those plants because the cuttings typically have one overnight in Amsterdam, one overnight in Memphis, and then
Yeah.
on the third day they come to us. So we usually see quite a bit more loss or reduced quality on plants that come from a farm, like let's say in Kenya.
How are the cuttings shipped? How are they protected from wilting?
So cuttings are always bagged in groups of they do a 4% overpack. So you order by the hundred and you get sent 104 in a
Hmm.
bag. So we usually order I don't know let's say a normal production week we probably are getting somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 cuttings in per week. So they all come in as in a box with maybe 20 bags of 100, and they're
Hmm.
all packed with ice packs and probably every 10th box or so we'll have a USB temperature tracker. So once we get the
Wow.
box, we actually upload the temperature sensor data and send it back to the breeder so that they can really have a tight eye on their supply chain management, basically.
Wow. So, what temperature is a safe temperature for the plants to be in during shipment?
Yeah, during shipment, they're really just hoping for as cool as they can be. Of course, with temperatures like you're saying we see next week, it actually, of course, can get too cold. They're usually aiming for somewhere between 40 and 45 degrees. And then when we get them, typically if we get them late in a day and we have to stick them the next day, we keep them in a cooler at 50 degrees.
Are tender plants okay with that temperature? Or is this like hardy perennials?
Yeah, this is everything really, annuals and perennials.
Oh, that's really surprising.
Yeah, but like for something sensitive, like let's say like a Rex begonia, the
Uh-huh.
cuttings actually are just individual leaves.
Yeah.
They will actually be packed. Like if you can picture a cardboard box, with a styrofoam box inside it. The cuttings will be in
Uh-huh.
there with the ice on the outside of the styrofoam. So the ice still keeps it cool, but it won't directly touch the plants and it won't get as cool as it would. So they do have some way to limit how much the ice cools the cutting in the box if it's something that's particularly sensitive to it.
That's really interesting because when we as consumers buy a plant online during a cold season, it'll often ship with a heat pack.
Right.
Kind of the opposite.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
the difference there because we're dealing with rooted plants versus cuttings?
Yeah, that is a factor. Typically, as long as you're not getting like we sometimes see packages that get packed incorrectly, and the cuttings will touch the ice, and then those will all be basically melted away by the time we get them. You know,
Yeah,
they just turn to
yeah,
snot basically. So,
yeah.
the big issue, the biggest issue that we have with ethylene sensitive plants, so like a great example would be geraniums, is on any plant when the plant is cut, so when the cutting is taken, at that wound site, the plant begins to emit ethylene gas. And on
Oh,
something like a geranium, they are very sensitive to increased concentrations of ethylene gas. So if they're in the box for too long, once you finally take them out, all of the leaves will be yellowed and eventually they'll fall off. Now, we do have plant growth regulators that can counteract that, but it's really important that you have like a policy in place. So the box comes, there's someone to open it, there's someone to make sure the gas all comes out and take the cuttings out and lay them flat so that that way when it comes time to stick them, they've had time to air out, for lack of a better term.
wow. Mind blown once again.
Yeah, it's quite a bit to it. And then just quickly, I'll talk a little bit about tissue culture. So
Okay.
the vast majority of tissue culture labs are in Southeast Asia. And so those actually all come in like in a plastic beaker. And usually they're also in groups of 100. They're grown in this beaker to, you know, roughly the same size as a cutting, about 2, 3 inches. And they're shipped kind of at a more neutral ambient temperature, and then
Hmm.
those will get brought in. Actually, they're grown in a gel, and then we'll plant those too. So they have a little bit of a longer travel time, but because they usually have roots on them, they stand up to it quite a bit better.
Okay. And you mentioned that they're the people, the companies that send you the plants from all over the place, they have to forecast it pretty far ahead of time. But when you order them, who makes the decision on your end about what you're going to grow? Is it sort of your creative decision? Is it what your customers, like the nurseries, are ordering? Or is there any input from brands like big brands, maybe something like Proven Winners, where they're like, we're releasing this plant this year, we want you to grow it?
Yeah, so the the short answer is it depends. And really what it depends on is who the customer is. So, you know, when you're in a large scale operation, your customers are typically big box stores,
Hmm.
and by and large, they are the ones who are telling you what they want to sell in their stores. So,
Hmm.
I would say like for a greenhouse like mine, typically it's probably about 85% of what we grow is dictated to us. And it can be something as simple as we want X number of red petunias in these weeks of the year, and we can pick
Hmm.
what variety of red petunia we want to grow. Or
Okay.
they could even go down to say, you know, we want you to ship us, I'm making this up, but 500 flats of petunia madness mix every week from week 13 to week 30 or whatever it is. So they can go as specific as varieties. And then we do so like in your example, if Proven Winners is coming out with a new plant line, typically they will send it to us a year in advance and we'll grow it out so our customers can see it and then they can decide if that's something they want to do. And
Okay.
a
Okay.
lot of the big breeders also make mixes like basket mixes or planter mixes,
Uh-huh.
and they trial these for quite a few years to make sure that they all grow together and have a habit that works with the other plants in the mix,
Uh-huh.
and then the customers can pick those. So a lot of times when you go to box stores, you see hanging baskets and there's you know 6 or 7 or 15 different mixes. I'd
Hmm.
say probably 80% of those are actually designed by the breeders so that they all play well together in a pot,
That makes sense.
and maybe the other 20% would be something that we make up at the greenhouse and the customer likes, and then they order from us. So it's yeah, a little bit of everything really.
Do you start a lot from seed, or is most stuff from cuttings or tissue culture?
Um, I would guess it's probably about 40% seed, 40% cutting, 20% tissue culture. Um,
Uh-huh.
and just quickly to explain why you might pick one of those over the other, with seed varieties, usually these are plants that are what you would maybe consider like basic bedding plants. So things like alyssum clear crystals white is a really common alyssum. It's something that a customer wants to buy 50 of. They don't want to buy one of because they want to do a big scale planting in their garden, or they want to use it for
Mm-hmm.
hanging baskets. And so those
Okay.
grow true from seed, and seed is inexpensive. So things like that we would grow from seed. But we do perennials as well and longer term crops from seed. And some of the like new big items are actually marketed to us as coming from seed because they can be easier to grow. And then what we grow in cuttings is typically more what you'd consider like a premium annual. So there's varieties of like Calibrachoa that don't grow true to seed. They can only be propagated vegetatively by cutting.
Yeah.
But we also do quite a bit of perennials that way too. And then tissue culture is largely for varieties that don't propagate well, either by seed or by cutting. It's almost always well, it's absolutely always more expensive than either of those types. So you only really grow something from tissue culture if it's impossible to grow otherwise, or if you really just you can get it in cutting, but it's really difficult to root. It's not worth the time to try to fight it. So you spend a little bit extra money to do tissue culture, and then the other time you'd use tissue culture would be like for house plants, where you may have a plant that won't reproduce itself on a short enough time scale where it really just doesn't make sense financially to grow these out naturally, or they may have kind of like incipient virus or disease issues that can be passed through the propagative material. So
Wow.
there are a lot of houseplants that can have a virus that can pass through the seed if the plant produces seed, or can easily be passed in cuttings. So the benefit of tissue culture is that because the way they propagate the plants comes from meristematic cells that are undifferentiated. These are cells that can't actually have the virus pass into them. So they are
Oh,
plants that are
wow.
made in a lab from what is effectively the plant equivalent of stem cells, and they are verified to be virus free. So plants that are really susceptible to viruses typically are produced as tissue culture because it's the only way to get plants that you can guarantee don't have this virus.
Can you give us a couple examples of those two categories, plants that are more difficult to grow in other ways than tissue culture, and then plants that are susceptible to diseases that you choose to get through tissue culture?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some specifics because a lot of
Sorry, I
the
put you on the spot
no,
there.
no, it's okay. It's okay. A lot of I see tissue culture is like maybe three-quarters of tissue culture plants are house plants, and so they usually fall under more like just as an example, like most calatheas that are produced in a greenhouse come from a tissue culture lab because they can be susceptible to viruses, and also they
Hmm.
can be difficult to propagate. I know from a gardening perspective, like I'm just going to use a perennial as an example because it's something I think a
Hmm.
lot of people can understand. For me, as a gardener, I want to plant one perennial. I'm going to grow it for a year or two, and then I'm going to divide it. Now I have, let's say, three, and I can grow those out and divide them on and on. But in a
Hmm.
greenhouse, I don't really want to dedicate space to growing those plants to a meaningful size
Right.
for that long. So a lot of times, like, yes, a calathea, you could grow large enough that you divide and then have more plants, but I really don't want to spend the square footage to grow a calathea for 2 years to be able to divide it, because not only is that space I can't use for something else, but that's 2 years of dealing with pests and disease. That's 2 years of potentially losing plants in my stock going down. So to buy, virus indexed tissue culture starts every year really saves me quite a bit of time.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. So, has each place you worked at had their own proprietary growing mix? And how much of that are you able to share with us?
Yeah, it's the actual recipe is usually proprietary, but I can share the basics. So basically, every greenhouse, with the exception of a few kind of specialty crops, uses a soilless mix. many cases, it's peat based. I know in the UK, peat is now banned. It is not
Mm-hmm.
banned in the US. There's a completely different supply source with Canada. And if
Mm-hmm.
anybody's interested in this, I'd be happy to explain a little bit more about that kind of later. There's quite a bit to it, but that's usually the base of the mix because it has a high cation exchange capacity. So it kind of plays
Mm-hmm.
the role of the soil in the mix with holding on to fertilizer and releasing it to the plants. And
Oh,
then
wow.
usually there's a composted bark component, but that's not true everywhere. But I have seen it used. And then typically some perlite. And then the thing that is most proprietary is the starting fertilizer charge. So most greenhouses kind of have their secret brew of fertilizer that they have mixed into their base soilless mix, and then typically a lime program that has to do with the amount of peat, and then also the quality of water that the greenhouse uses because well water will react differently than rainwater. And so the limes, there's a couple different types of limes, and the ratio of that to the bulk of the mix is kind of something that greenhouses play with throughout the course of the year as the water quality changes.
And that's to neutralize the pH of the mix.
Correct. Yes, because peat is very acidic, so lime will help to neutralize that or to bring the pH up to something that's more appropriate for the plants in the greenhouse.
Okay.
Um, a lot of growers are switching to coco coir instead of
Uh-huh.
peat or a combination of the two. And one of the reasons why is because you can get coco coir in similar lengths of fiber as to peat. So you can have fine peat with a short fiber length or a little bit coarser peat that has a longer fiber length. You can have the same for coir, but one issue that everybody ran into in 2021 was shipping was incredibly expensive due to COVID, and Sri Lanka had an actual mountain of coconut coir that nobody
Oh,
could
wow.
afford to bring to North
Oh,
America.
wow.
So the greenhouse I was at the time, we had actually like two ships worth of coconut coir booked, but we literally could not afford to bring it from Sri Lanka. Like no
Wow.
matter what we grew, and it could never pay off the bill that it would be for this coconut coir. So during that time, um, a lot of growers, myself included, switched to a product called hydrofiber, which is a shredded yellow pine that comes from North Carolina. So it's a lot less expensive.
Wow. Never heard of
Yeah,
it.
it's kind of new. It's different because it does not hold on to water the way peat does, but it is actually a state protected industry, so it is by default sustainable. It's grown in America, so it uses American labor. It's a lot cheaper for shipping because you can put it on a train instead of having to put it on a ship. So a lot of people are switching to a hydrofiber mix, myself included. So it works really well. It's a lot less expensive. It's better for the environment because it doesn't come from 12,000 miles away. And I think you'll be seeing a lot more of that in commercial mixes in the next few years.
Well, that's fascinating. What would you say the biggest differences are between peat and coco coir and what was it again?
Hydrofiber. So, yeah, it's called hydrofiber. There's a couple different products, but that's the main one.
Would you say it's the moisture retention that's the biggest difference?
Yeah, and the acidity. So, um,
Okay.
definitely in a production greenhouse, if you're switching from peat to hydrofiber, you have to really look at your lime process to make sure that you are taking the pH of the mix into account. But yeah, it's pretty manageable. You have to change your fertilizer approach a little bit because the hydrofiber has a lower cation exchange capacity, so it holds less of the nutrients that you apply. And so if you fertilize the same way as you do in a peat mix, you actually will end up with plants that don't grow quite as well. So it's all
Hmm.
it's all a learning process, but it's all manageable.
And now a word from one of our community members.
Howdy, I'm Bee from the Lone Star State. Subscribe to the Garden Revival BBQ podcast. It's a heck of a lot easier to consume in the car than Texas BBQ. Trust me.
Thanks, B. And my next question has to do with a conversation you and I had that just absolutely dropped my jaw, and that's how you water plants.
Okay.
So tell us about that process. It's really, really interesting to me.
Okay, so that's kind of a long answer. But we have several different approaches to how we water plants. So, the most basic is somebody stands there with a hose and waters the plants overhead. That's also the least efficient because you actually have to have somebody standing there, and it's also the least uniform because no matter how smooth you think you are, you cannot apply the same amount of water to 5,000 plants when you're standing and walking through a bay. So that's kind of an expensive way. It takes a lot of labor input, and it's also not really very uniform. We
Mm-hmm.
also have sprinklers in the greenhouse. They hang down and water the plants from overhead. That's better, but still not perfect. And then in most greenhouses, we have an irrigation boom. So it's a robot with an arm that has spray nozzles at an interval, and it travels along a rail at a program that the grower can define and waters the plant so you get a much more even watering throughout the crop. We can take it one step farther. So we have infrared leaf sensors now that can actually measure the water pressure or the pressure of the water vapor right at the leaf stomates.
Oh,
So we can
wow.
see when we have a certain humidity in the greenhouse, we can actually measure the amount of moisture loss from the leaf. And we can use a computer to tell us basically, okay, this is a poinsettia cutting. It is losing water at a rate of, I'm making this up, but let's say 5 grams an hour. And we can know that, in the next 5 to 6 hours, we'll need to irrigate. And the boom can actually make that decision by itself and travel through the bay and water as needed. Obviously, that's expensive, but you get a much more uniform crop, and you can also apply fertilizers and even do chemical treatments through it. So um, it's really nice. It's really high tech. It's fun to use, and it does save actually quite a bit of labor. So growers can manage bigger areas and use these booms to help themselves.
Wow. And you were talking about when we spoke earlier about how the pots are actually weighed to check for moisture level.
Yep. So, in most greenhouses, there's either on the ground or there's tables that the bedding plants are grown on, and then up above there's conveyor systems for hanging baskets. And many systems these days actually, so imagine like a long conveyor belt that goes in a loop, kind of like a carousel, but oblong.
Uh-huh.
And at one end, there's a watering nozzle. And so you turn it on, and the baskets start moving. And when the basket gets before the watering nozzle, it goes through a scale and the computer will say, okay, my target weight, this is something the grower puts in, 12-inch hanging basket, I want it to weigh 12 pounds when it's watered. So the scale will weigh it and say, okay, this basket is 8.7 pounds. And it knows that water is 8 pounds per gallon. So when it goes under the nozzle, it knows how many seconds the nozzle needs to run to bring that basket up to 12 pounds. And you can use that and also tell the computer, okay, I don't want you to water until you get to 6 pounds. So if the basket goes by and it's 8.5, then it won't water. If the basket goes by and it's 5.9, then it will, and it'll water up to that target weight. So you get a lot more consistency in your crop. And that's also something that we do with seed plug production. So we know, like on a 288 cell tray, that the target weight of water and soil to break down the seed coat to get the best level of germination is 1,150 grams. So we run
Wow.
the seed trays through the line, we pack them with soil, we measure those trays to make sure they're 750 grams. Then we seed them, cover with vermiculite, and then we water to target a range of right at 1,050 to 1,150 grams. And we keep it at that for 4 days, and then that will get us our maximum germination rate. And then after that, the amount of water actually decreases because you need the soil to dry out for the roots to form. So
Mm-hmm.
weighing is very labor intensive, but it is far and away the most accurate way to determine when you need to water. And kind of a fun project for gardeners if they want when they're growing seeds is if they weigh even just one tray every single day at the same time, you can actually start, if you graph it, you can actually start to see how much water per day do my plants use. And you can calculate what's called the evapotranspiration rate, where you can figure
Wow.
out how much water you are losing from your soil surface due to heat and how much water you're losing through your leaves from the plant taking it up. And then you can start to get a feel for, okay, my seed tray loses I'm making this up, of course, 23 grams a day. And so if my target is 1150 and today I'm at 1140, I know that I'm going to, let's say my water threshold is 1050. So if I'm at 1150 and that's my target and I want to water when I get below 1050 and I measure that every day I lose 25 grams, I can do the math and know how many days it's going to be until I really need to water again. And so with our irrigation booms, to go back to that, we know exactly how many grams of water one pass of the boom puts out. So I know if I need to add 400 grams, when my boom goes by, it adds 100. So I know I need the boom to go by 4 times to get me up to my target water weight. So a lot of science there. It's a lot of work, and I don't think any gardener is going to go weigh all of their plants because that's not really feasible, but it is kind of a fun project to see exactly what your plants are doing and when.
Well, you're our first guest to give our listeners homework, so that's pretty
Okay, I
special.
want to see these graphs. Let's see them.
Yes. And I mean, it's really not practical for you to do the finger test for every plant in your greenhouse of millions of plants.
No, but I will tell you that I had an irrigator on my team when I was in Washington State, and she was an irrigator for 30 years, and she could walk by a tray of plants and lift it with her toe and tell you if it needed to be watered or not, and she was never wrong. And so there are people who have that as a gift, yes.
I bow down to knowledge like that. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking one thing that's kind of funny about the hydrofiber is, you water soil, it gets darker. When it dries up, it gets lighter. But hydrofiber, for whatever reason, on the top is always light. So it always looks dry, but it might only be dry down a 1/4 inch. So you really got to be careful when it comes to watering because it might actually be soaked and you don't know.
Wow. I'm learning so much. I have to process all this. Wow. The next question is about plant health, because that's another, like watering, that is another issue we all have to deal with, and you have to deal with it on a scale bigger than any of us. And if you sell us sick plants or infested plants, we will get very angry and you won't get your money. Right?
Right. So, obviously, something I always say is growing plants is really easy. Growing a lot of plants is very hard. And also, paradoxically, in the greenhouse, it's really easy to grow 10,000 of something, and it's really difficult to grow 20 because it's easy to say, it's 20 plants, what does it matter? But it does, of course. But when it comes to plant health, kind of on the same vein, I think anybody can go in a greenhouse and grow, let's say, 80% of a crop. It's a plant. It wants to grow. You give it water, it grows. But it might cost you 80% of your sale price to have a plant that's ready to ship. So that 20% of plants that you can't grow is where all the profit is in a greenhouse. So it's really important. I mean, plant health, it goes without saying, is one of the most important considerations for the greenhouse. So, it kind of all starts with having healthy plants in propagation. And what makes a healthy plant in propagation is a plant that has a healthy root system, is disease-free, is growing vigorously, and doesn't have pests. And part of the reason why you grow in a greenhouse is to be able to manipulate the environment to give the plant its healthiest conditions. So most greenhouses you'll see are divided into a lot of different smaller sections so you can have different environments, because a lavender doesn't want to grow, or I shouldn't say doesn't want to grow, a lavender doesn't grow in the same conditions optimally as a petunia does, or a dahlia, or anything. So so a lot of times these crops are divided into different sections so that they can have the environment that they need. That's the key. They need an optimal temperature, an optimal soil pH, optimal water quality, although that's one of the hardest things to really manage, optimal light levels. And then it's a matter of being treated well. Same as in gardening, same as in keeping houseplants, the biggest risk, the most common thing that kills plants in a greenhouse is overwatering. It's really easy to do. Right now it's January, it's cloudy outside, watering is dangerous. There's a common saying in the greenhouse industry that the most dangerous thing in the greenhouse is a bored grower, because they walk around and they see something and they water it, and it probably could have waited 2 days. So So, it's the same exact approach to keeping houseplants or maintaining the garden. But the difference is that in a greenhouse, you really can't tolerate any issues. So in a garden, in my garden at my house, I don't really mind having pests in there because they're part of an ecosystem. But in a greenhouse, the ecosystem is synthetic. It's not natural. If you get a thrip infestation and you have a block of 35,000 calibrachoas, those thrips are going to multiply like in front of your eye because there's nothing keeping them in check. And so, it's not a comfortable thing to really talk about, but there are chemicals that are used for disease control and for pest control, but their use can be limited by having proper growing techniques in the first place. Now, when it's cool, you're going to have aphids. When it's warm, you're going to have thrips. I just had last year, I had a huge crop of fuchsia cuttings that came in from Israel, of all places, and it was just loaded with aphids. So, in those circumstances, we do use treatments. They're not always chemical treatments, and they're not always, gnarly toxic chemicals. In fact, because the greenhouse is an enclosed space, chemicals that are legally allowed to be used in the greenhouse are actually significantly less toxic than chemicals that are used in the field. So it's actually surprising.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. So like for poinsettia crop, for example, there's only a few chemicals that you can use, and they work decently. But there's a lot of harsher chemicals that would work on the insects you might have on a poinsettia. They would work a lot better. You can't use them on a poinsettia, but you could spray them on corn or beans or pumpkins or food crops all day long, no problem. So it's actually kind of surprising.
Wow.
And then I have kind of two other parts to pest management. So the first is one of the things that we really keep in mind is the end consumer. So we hear a lot in gardening about neonics, and most greenhouses have phased out neonic pesticides. And the reason we hear about them is because they're dangerous to bees. So proper crop timing is really important when it comes to pollinator safety. There are chemicals that are legal to use in a greenhouse that can be dangerous to bees if the plant is in bud or has flowers that are open. So it's important when you have a crop that if you have something like that you need to use, that you're aware of that and only use it when you have several weeks until the plant sets bud, so that way when the flower is open and it goes to the customer, you don't have a hanging basket with dead bees underneath, because nobody wants that. The greenhouse growers don't want that. The customer doesn't want that, and the bees certainly don't want that, right? So that is definitely something that we take in mind. And we do also have chemicals for disease control. But one other aspect of it that I think is really cool, and I've been involved with a lot, is using biological insects in the greenhouse, because for the same reason that pests can proliferate, biologicals can be used really effectively because it is a relatively closed system. Now, of course, windows open and bugs go in and out and doors open and people walk in. So it's not perfect, but we have had actually quite a bit of success with nematodes, with predatory mites that go after spider mites, even different types of wasps. There's a insect called Aureus. It's called I might have this wrong, but I believe it's called the minute pirate bug. And that's a predatory beetle that actually flies around and eats a lot of plant pests. And so that's something that we're seeing a whole lot more of in the greenhouse. I think that is going to be the future. As of today, there are no new chemicals under trial for pest control in the greenhouse. So what we have is all we're ever going to have. And the more we use them, the less effective they are. So I believe that in my lifetime, there will be only biological insects for pest control. But on top of insects, we have actually beneficial bacteria and fungi that can be used as well. So there are new products that are like parasitic fungi that we can treat the plants with that actually infest the plant pests and end up controlling them that way. So that's kind of a neat, kind of cutting edge of science. I have had these wasps I've used that come in. They are a parasitic wasp, and they get shipped to us in a mummified body of a moth. And so we actually put this
God.
dead moth in the greenhouse and have and have wasps eat their way out of its thorax and then fly around the greenhouse to eat
Oh,
pests.
wow.
So it's pretty interesting. And then
Oh,
on the
wow.
disease side, we have a kind of a whole range of beneficial microbes, bacteria and fungi that can outcompete organisms that can negatively impact plants. So a common issue that we deal with in the greenhouse is Pythium. That's root rot. It's something that can live in water. So a lot of greenhouses use like a pond to store their irrigation water or
Mhm.
tanks, and Pythium can live there. So you could end up watering your plants in with root rot. And oh yeah, by the way, sorry, I know you're not a big fan of bugs, so we'll move on from
It's
that.
okay.
So we actually have different types of fungi we can apply to our plants through our watering system that will colonize the surface of the root and basically just block out the Pythium fungus from being able to penetrate the root and attack it. So,
Wow.
there's a whole lot of science being done on using different organisms to outcompete the negative organisms that you can see in the greenhouse, whether that's insects or diseases or whatever it is. So it's really complex, but that's a huge factor in plant health, and it changes every day.
Do you reuse things like pots and other equipment? Do you have to sanitize everything?
For the most part, yes. A lot of greenhouses like mine have actual machines that can sanitize trays because, we might use 2 to 3 million trays in a year. So, of course, a lot of them get shipped to the stores and the customers end up with them. But when we have like crops that we dump and we save the pots from them, then yeah, they all get sanitized and reused. One other kind of an issue that a gardener wouldn't really face is we use plant growth regulators in the greenhouse. That's something that I think we'll
Mhm.
talk about in a little bit here. And
Mhm.
some plants are really sensitive to plant growth regulators at concentrations down to parts per billion. And so there are some
Wow.
plants like a pansy that you absolutely cannot use in a used pot because if it ever had a plant that was treated with PGRs in it, that pansy will actually show distortion from the PGR, even if it was
Oh,
from
wow.
years before. And some greenhouses have like the plants are on basically like a landscape fabric that's on top of sand, but some have plants that are on a concrete surface, and that concrete can actually also hold on to really really minute concentrations of PGRs that can have kind of this insidious impact on plants that always leaves the grower kind of scratching their head at why does my plant look like this, because it's kind of the last thing you think of. So it's all a big
Yeah.
puzzle, and that's a lot of the fun of it is trying to figure out what all these problems are and solving them or staying ahead of them.
Wow. I keep saying wow, but wow.
I have a story on that if you want. That will make you say wow a lot. um,
Okay, let's go.
okay. I've shared videos of this in the past, but the greenhouse I used to work at was all glass, and glass has really high light transmission. So
Mhm.
when you're growing poinsettias in the summertime, it's actually too strong of light for them. They really suffer with that high of light. So we I think you've seen this. We've used a helicopter to apply a light chalk to the surface of the greenhouse that actually just cuts the light.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really fun to watch, and that helicopter pilot is very brave. But I can post a video of this on the Discord if anybody wants.
Yes,
Um,
please.
but they do a couple passes where they drop this chalk. It looks like white paint, but it's actually liquefied chalk onto the
Mhm.
surface of the greenhouse, and it cuts light transmission by somewhere between like 10 and 20% depending on how thick they apply it.
Mhm.
But also there's different chalk formulations that will alter the spectrum of light that comes through the greenhouse. So you might have one that lets less infrared light in because it actually helps block some heat during summer. You might have some that block ultraviolet light for a couple different reasons. But the one we use is just a standard chalk just to cut the light transmission. And then the way it works is then here comes September, your days are a lot shorter, the sun is lower in the sky, so now all of a sudden it's too dark. Your poinsettias need more light to grow. So here comes
Mhm.
the helicopter pilot back, and he just drops a cleaner. It's just like a light acid that dissolves the chalk, and then when it rains, the chalk solution just gets rinsed off, and then you have clear glass again. But in a greenhouse like the one I worked in that captured rainwater, one thing we found out after a year, I should say, is the helicopter pilot had applied an herbicide, a very, very strong herbicide in a forestry project he was working on, and he didn't sufficiently clean his tanks. So he came to the greenhouse in September. We had 250,000 poinsettias and about 500,000 primroses, a little less, but somewhere around there. And he applied the solution to the roof of the greenhouse. We capture rainwater, but we always flush the tanks quite a bit once that cleaner gets put on because we don't want any of that in our water system. So it rains for a week. We close the tanks and let them fill back up. We start watering our plants. All of a sudden, everything is dying. We lost 180,000 primroses and somewhere between 50 and 75,000 poinsettias. And the problem is when it's happening, it's not clear what the cause is. So we're running soil tests, we're running tissue analysis. We had 3 different labs across the country do panel analysis for common herbicides in the leaf tissue, and we had all of our results were negative. So nutrition was fine, no diseases were found, no chemicals found in the leaves. I mean, we had experts from around the world come, and we're looking at this. One guy's like, hey, did you fire someone recently? Did they break in the middle of the night and pour Roundup in your fertilizer tank? You know, like we went down all of this crazy road because we really didn't put 2 and 2 together with the helicopter, because this is something that we do every single year. And then the following year, the guy comes and he trailers the helicopter in on a truck, and then he takes off from there to do the greenhouse. And we're standing there next to the trailer where he parks the helicopter every year, and there's a brown line in the grass that's exact same length as the spray boom, the arms on his helicopter. And we said, you know, what do you make of that? And he goes, yeah, that's probably from that stuff I used last year. That stuff lasts for 3 years. And the reason our tests didn't come up with it is because that herbicide is enough to distort young plants at concentrations almost down to 1 part per trillion. So there is no test on Earth sensitive enough to determine that. And we lost, I wouldn't want to guess, but high 6-figure, low 7-figure amount of plants. It was a really, really bad day.
Wow.
And you know, as the grower, everybody's pointing the finger at me. And I got to say that after a year, when we finally found that out, I slept a lot better.
Yeah,
I was
bet.
really, really worried about that. Luckily, my boss was super cool, and he knew that there was absolutely nothing I could have done that would have caused that widespread of plant loss. But that was a very, very painful experience as a grower, because not having the answer, you know, here comes the next year, you got to grow these plants again. What happened last year to cause all this issue? I lost a lot of sleep that year, I can tell you that.
Yeah. Are you insured for things like that? Like, is the greenhouse insured?
Some greenhouses can be. Yeah, it depends. That one was not. Some are. But for the most part, greenhouses really aren't. So this isn't really related to plant health or chemicals or anything. But the last greenhouse I was at was a big windstorm. The roof blew off in the middle of the night when it was 8 degrees, and I think they lost somewhere between $1 and $2 million worth of succulents just from one night of it getting that cold in the greenhouse. So it happens, you know, it happens a lot. And we're lucky in the greenhouse we actually have protection, because I think about crops in the field and a bad hailstorm or something, you know, what are they going to do?
Wow. Can somebody please look up synonyms for the word wow for me? Because I keep saying the same thing over and over. Wow.
Yeah, so some horror stories there. Those are not the fun days, that's for sure.
Space Butler is saying amazing. Amazing. You mentioned earlier about adding some starter fertilizer to your mix being a very proprietary thing. Mm-hmm. So at which points do you add fertilizer besides that? Is it something that happens with every watering a little bit, or at specific points in the growth?
Okay, every answer I give you, I start with, it depends on the greenhouse. But there's kind of 3 ways.
That's a perfectly fine answer.
So there's kind of 3 ways to approach it. And I would say that fertilizer is probably the single biggest differentiator between a professional grower and a home gardener, because the options available to a commercial grower are so much broader. Mm-hmm. But also the science behind it is something that takes a lot of research to really understand. And I think there's a lot of myths in the home side of fertilizer, which I'd like to talk about a little bit. But to answer your question, there's kind of 3 ways you do it. You either for long-term crops like perennials, something that you might grow for 18 months before you sell, typically you'll mix controlled release fertilizer into your soil mix before you plant. So
Okay.
controlled release fertilizer, you hear of Osmocote. There's a lot of brands. Osmocote is one that's used in the greenhouse a lot. But the idea of it, just for those who don't know, is it's pre-formulated fertilizer granules that are coated in a polymer that will actually become porous at temperatures above 65 degrees usually. So there's different products for lower temperatures and different ones for higher. But the idea is if you have perennials in a cold greenhouse or in the field over winter, you're not releasing your feed onto your plants. And then when it gets warm and the sun is out, then the fertilizer is being made available to these plants. And the longevity of the polymer kind of it's what determines how long that Osmocote or controlled release fertilizer is good for. So you can get like a mix that lasts for a month, you can get one that lasts for 6 months, and you can kind of get anything in between. So the downside to it is if you have a spell of hot days, you can really eat through a lot of that fertilizer that's in the pot. So, once you mix it in, you mix it at a certain rate, but then you have no control over when it comes in and out. Now for bedding plants and shorter term crops, because a lot of annuals, once they're transplanted to their final pots, they're really only in the greenhouse for somewhere between let's say 4 and 12 weeks, depending on what the crop is. But your common 6-pack verbena, right? You probably transplant it and put it in the greenhouse, and then on the 5th week you pick it back up and ship it. So for plants like that, we typically water what we call constant feed. So every single time they're irrigated, they're getting a dose of fertilizer. Some, smaller greenhouses may fertilize once a week and water with just water the other times of the week, but typically people are doing it with every watering.
Would there be a combination of a slow release and the water soluble, or is it one or the other?
There is usually a combination for long-term perennials. So actually, this might be a nice time to talk about one of the kind of myths of fertilizer, and I can use this as an example to explain it. So one thing I see a lot in with gardeners, I see it a little bit on the Discord and other places online, people chatting about fertilizer. There's a really good understanding of the idea that fertilizer labels usually show the NPK ratio. You might buy a fertilizer that's 5.55 or 10.42 or whatever. And just using let's say a 5.55 and a 10.10.10. So people know that if you have a 5.55, then you have 5% by weight nitrogen, 5% by weight phosphorus, and 5% by weight potassium. But then people see a 10.10.10 and think, okay, well, that's twice as strong. But that's really not true, because that's only telling you what the weight of that nutrient is in the bag of fertilizer or in the can of fertilizer or whatever it is. But if I apply a 5.55 fertilizer and I mix it in my watering can at 1 tablespoon of fertilizer per gallon, I can take the 10.10.10 and water it at 0.5 tablespoon per gallon, and I can have an equivalent strength. So in the greenhouse, we measure our fertilizers by the parts per million of nitrogen in the water, because then that way we can determine a relative strength.
Okay. So
for bedding plants, when I am watering, I'm usually using a constant feed of 200 parts per million with nitrogen. Now, that is only telling me what the strength of the nitrogen is, and the different blends of fertilizer I use will determine what my phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and all my trace elements are. So I have access to, let's say, 100 different mixes that I could use for different things, but they're always metered by what my parts per million of nitrogen is, so that I can know that if I apply a 17,517 at 50 ppm, I can apply a 16,316 at 200 ppm, and I can kind of tell a difference in strength between them, because in the bag they're useless to me anyway. So the relative strength between the two of them, or relative feed rate between the two of them, unmixed, is a meaningless unit to me.
Okay.
So it always depends on how much we mix per unit of water, and we have dosing machines for in the greenhouse. So to answer your question, if I have a long-term crop that has controlled release fertilizer in the pot, then I will also reduce my level of constant rate water soluble feed to kind of bring my pot to the correct target parts per million of nitrogen that I'm aiming for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there an assessment you make as you go of how much fertilizer your plant needs, or is it a formula you follow year after year that depends on what type of substrate you're using, and it's just sort of it's down to a science?
It's down to a science, but there's a ton of variables that we can't always control. So you have your water quality, your potting media, um, your amount of light that actually, I can apply 200 ppm every single day, but if it's dark and the plant's not metabolizing, then I'm actually
Right,
building that up in the
right.
soil. So
Yeah, makes sense.
constant soil tests to measure what our electrical conductivity is. That's a good way of knowing how much salt is in the soil. And that's analogous to our concentration of fertilizer actually in the soil. So
Okay.
when it comes to diagnosing issues, one that you can see a lot in the greenhouse is salt buildup. And typically
Mm-hmm.
that happens this time of year because it's dark, plants are wet, and you are building up fertilizer in your soil. You have also, confusingly, the opposite issue this time of year, which is if I have, let's say, a petunia, because I'm planting petunias next week, let's say they need to be fed at a rate of 200 ppm, and typically we do it 3 times a week. Let's just say it's that. Well, if it's dark and my plants aren't metabolizing, if I feed 200 ppm, but I'm actually only able to water once every 9 days because the pot stays wet because it's not very actively metabolizing or
Yeah.
actually just transpiring, the plant will actually become underfed even though it is adequately watered or even overwatered because it's going through the fertilizer in the pot and I'm unable to add more because the pot is staying wet. So it can actually
Mm.
be really
Yeah.
confusing of am I overwatering and that's causing root issues? Am I overwatering and that's causing underfeed? Or am I overfeeding or am I feeding accurately? So those are the things that the grower really has to deal with. And just something I will share with anybody listening that will really help with diagnosing feed issues is it's really worth it to go to the library and get a book on soil management or look online. You can find charts of what's called nutrient mobility in the plants. So, typically almost all plants they need 13 elements. So it's the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium are considered secondary macronutrients, and then the trace elements. So, you can begin to diagnose nutrient issues in your plant depending on where on the plant you are seeing these issues arise. So, for nutrient like nitrogen, it's considered mobile in the plant, which means you can have a plant that's growing healthily, it has an adequate supply of nitrogen, and then if that supply is cut off and the plant begins to become deficient, the plant can pull nitrogen from lower, older leaves and deposit it into newer leaves so that the new growth is healthy. But there are other nutrients in the plant such as iron, that are immobile. So once iron is deposited in the leaf, it cannot be moved from that. Yeah, I see what you're posting there. That's a good rule of thumb. I've seen this one before. So like to go back to the iron, if you're seeing
Mm-hmm.
chlorosis in the growth tips of the plants, but the lower leaves are nice and dark green, you can begin to see that that is likely an iron issue and almost certainly not a nitrogen issue. Now, of course, your pH of your media plays into this because you may have an absolutely adequate supply of iron in your potting media, but the pH of that media is actually not allowing the iron to be taken up into the plant. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a whole nother story, but that goes back to we test an awful lot. We send tissue samples to the lab constantly. We have in-house testing. We send media samples to the lab to make sure our soil mixing line is doing what it needs to do. We calibrate it all constantly, but that's kind of a good way to determine nutritional availability in the plant and a good way to determine quickly what nutrients may be deficient or may be supplied at toxic levels. To have an oversupply of certain nutrients can be an issue as well.
Mm-hmm. And these charts, we do have some of these posted in Gardener U. in the soil composting and nutrients thread if anybody wants to check that out.
Yeah, that chart of soil pH affecting availability, it is really useful. Of course, pH changes much more rapidly in a pot than it does in the ground. So for the gardener, I if the plant grows fine most of the year, I would not consider that a sudden issue is pH related unless I know I'm planting an acid-loving plant in an alkaline soil or something like that. But if a plant has been growing fine for 2 years and then all of a sudden shows an issue, pH being the cause of that issue would be very low down my list of what might be the root cause of it.
Do you trust home pH tests for soil?
Short answer, not really. Long answer, yes. But I think just a good rule of thumb is that if it's something that you just stick in the soil, it's almost certainly not going to be very accurate.
Mm-hmm.
They make those pH tests where you mix a certain amount of your soil or your media with distilled water, and then you kind of shake it up, and you have those test strips. That's accurate enough for home use for sure.
Okay, great. And if anybody wants a more detailed analysis, of course, they can send it off to a lab. There's independent commercial labs, and then there are university-associated labs that are like cooperative extensions of U.S. universities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll do it for usually a pretty good price. Or free sometimes.
Absolutely, and even in the greenhouse, we use extension services if we have pests that have issues. I even just heard of a grower the other day who sent some of the thrips that he found in one of his crops to his local extension, and they actually did a DNA test on it to determine what greenhouse pesticides the thrips are resistant to.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the extension is a great service. If you live in the U.S., you're paying for it with your taxes, so take advantage of it. I mean, those are all super passionate people. A lot of the people I went to school with were really, hoping to get into that program because these are people who love helping others and love plants, and it's there for you to use. That's the whole point of it. So I highly, highly recommend getting involved with your university extension, even if you're emailing them pictures or something. That's a lot of really helpful folks there that they just love what they're doing. So it's an awesome resource.
I had no idea they actually went as far as DNA testing on thrips. That's amazing.
Yeah, of course. When I heard that, I went right back to my office and I started looking at mine, and mine doesn't offer, but it was pretty cool to hear.
Okay. That was a lot of really good information, so we're uploading this portion of the interview as part 1. We've got more in the nitty-gritty of professional greenhouse operations from Wes in part 2. Including info on day-length sensitive plants, plant growth regulators, and cool automation. Then, Wes answers our audience's big burning questions. Don't you just love Wes's enthusiasm? This is one man who clearly loves his job. Thanks, Wes. Thank you to our live audience and to our listeners on YouTube and all the podcast streaming apps. Please don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about the podcast. We'd love to share our love of gardening with more people. You can join us on Discord to chat at gardenrev.com/Discord. Submit your big burning questions, listen to our BBQs live, and see all the accompanying links and images we post. Read our blog on gardenrev.com and see our gardens on Instagram and YouTube at GardenRev. Bye!